Chapter 52 of The Cliff Climbers.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Thomas. The Cliff Climbers by Mayne REID. Chapter 52. Inflation and Failure. At length arrived the hour for making that important experiment, as to whether their aerial ship would prove herself airworthy. All three stood around the spot where the chopped grass and shawl wool were to be set on fire. This fuel itself appeared underneath, in a little heap lightly laid, and ready for the touch of the tinder. Karl had a piece of blazing torch in his hand. Caspar held one of the stay ropes to prevent the balloon from rising too rapidly, while Ossaroo, equipped as if for a journey, stood by the hamper in readiness when the proper time should arrive to pack himself into it. Alas for the frailty of human foresight! The most careful calculations often prove erroneous. Not that in the present instance there was any unforeseen error, for from the very first Karl had been distrustful of his data, and they were now to disappoint rather than deceive him. It was not written in the book of destiny that Ossaroo should ever set foot in that wicker car, or ever make an ascent by that balloon. The torch was applied to the chopped grass and shawl wool. Both blazed and smoked and smouldered, and, more being thrown on, the blaze was kept up continuously. The heated air ascended through the aperture, causing the great sphere of stitched skins to swell out to its full dimensions. It trembled and rocked from side to side like some huge monster in pain. It rose to the height of a few inches from the ground, sank, and then rose again, sank once more, and so kept on rising and sinking and bobbing about, but alas, never exhibiting sufficient ascending power to raise the hamper even as high as their heads. Karl continued to feed the furnace with the chopped grass and poshm, but all to no purpose. The air within was sufficiently heated to have raised it for miles had they been as low as sea level and the balloon constructed of lighter materials. As it was, all their efforts were in vain. The gigantic globe could not be raised above 6 feet from the ground. It had not power enough to carry up a cat, much less a man. In short, it was a failure. One more added to the long list of their dark disappointments. For more than an hour Karl continued to keep his fire ablaze. He even tried faggots of the resinous pine in hopes that by obtaining a greater strength of caloric he might still succeed in causing the balloon to soar upward. But there was no perceptible difference in the effect. It bopped about just as before, but still obstinately refused to ascend. At length, with the patience exhausted and hopes completely crushed, the engineer turned away from the machine which he had taken so much pains in constructing. For a moment he stood irresolute. Then, heaving a sigh at the recollection of his wasted labour, with sad, slow step he departed from the spot. Caspar soon followed him, fully participating in the feeling of grievous disappointment. Ossaroo took leave of the inflated monster in a different fashion. Drawing near to it, he stood for some seconds contemplating it in silence, as if reflecting on the vast amount of seam he had stitched to no purpose. Then, uttering a native ejaculation, coupled with a phrase that meant to say, "No good either for the earth, the water, or the air," he raised his foot, kicked the balloon in the side with such violence that the toe of his sandals burst a hole in the distended eel-skins, and, turning scornfully away, left the worthless machine to take care of itself. This task, however, it proved ill-adapted to accomplish, for the disappointed aeronauts had not gone many minutes from the ground when the heated air inside, which had for some time been gradually growing cooler, reached at length so low a temperature that the great sphere began to collapse and settle down upon the embers of the pine faggots still glowing red underneath. The consequence was that the inflammable skins, cords, and woodwork, coming in contact with the fire, began to burn like so much tinder. The flames ran upward, licking the oily eel-skins like the tongues of fiery serpents, and when the ci devant aeronauts looked back from the door of their hut, they perceived that the balloon was ablaze. Had the accident occurred 2 hours before, they would have looked upon it as the saddest of calamities. Now, however, they stood regarding that burning of the abandoned balloon with as much indifference as it is said to have been exhibited by Nero while contemplating the conflagration of the Seven-Hilled City. End of chapter 52. Recording by Mark Thomas.
Chapter 53 of The Cliff Climbers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cliff Climbers by Mayne REID. Chapter 53. another spell of despair. Never, during all the days of their sojourn in that valley of despond, did our adventurers feel more despondence than on the afternoon that succeeded the bursting of their great air bubble, the balloon. They felt that, in this effort, they had exhausted all their ingenuity, and so firmly were they convinced of its being the last, that no one thought about making another. The spirits of all three were prostrate in the dust, and seemed at length to have surrendered to despair. Of course, it was not that sort of despair which takes possession of one conscious of coming and certain death. It was far from being so dire as this, but for all it was a bitter feeling. They knew they could continue to live, perhaps as long there as elsewhere upon the earth, but what would life be worth to them, cut off from all communication with the world? For now, to the fullness of conviction, did they believe themselves thus isolated. In this position not one of the three had the slightest particle of the hermit, not one of them, but would have shuddered at the thought of becoming a Simon Stylites. You might suppose that, with books and nature to study, Karl could have made shift. True, with such companions he might have lived a less irksome life than either of the others, but even with these to accompany him, it is doubtful whether Karl could have passed the time, for it is not very certain that a man, knowing himself alone in the world, and forever to be alone, would care either for the books of men or the book of nature. As for Caspar, the thought that their lonely existence was to be perpetual was enough at times to send the blood rushing coldly through his veins. The Hindoo felt the affliction as much as either of his companions in misfortune, and sighed as much for his bamboo hut on the hot plains of Hindostan as they for their home in the far fatherland of Bavaria. It is true their situation was not so bad as if each had been left alone by himself. Many a poor castaway upon a desert island has been condemned to a far more unhappy fate. They knew and acknowledged this. Each had the other two for companions. But as they reflected thus, they could not hinder their thoughts from casting forward into the future, perhaps not distant, when one of them might leave that valley without the aid of either rope ladders or balloons, and then another, leaving the last of the three lonely and forlorn. With such sad reflections did they pass the evening of that day, and the morning and evening of that which followed. They took no heed of time, and could scarce summon sufficient energy to cook their frugal meals. The spirit to plan and the energy to act seemed both to have departed from them at once and forever. This state of things could not long continue. As already said, the soul of man holds within itself a power of resuscitation. So long as it continues to live, it may hope to recover from the heaviest blow. Broken hearts are more apparent than real, and even those that are worst shattered have their intervals in which they are restored to a perfect soundness. The slave in his chains, the prisoner within his dark dungeon, the castaway on his desert isle, all have their hours of joy, perhaps as vivid and lasting as those of the king upon his throne or the conqueror in his car of triumph. On earth there is no happiness unmingled with alloy, and perhaps there is no sorrow that may not in time find solace. On the second day, succeeding their last great disappointment, the spirits of all three began to revive, and those natural wants which, whether we will or not, force themselves upon our attention, commenced to claim their consideration. Karl was the first to recognize these necessities. If they were to live there for life, he reasoned, and this seemed no longer a doubtful supposition, it would be of no use giving way to despondency, mopping out their days like mutes at a funeral. Better far to lead an active life, and live well too, by providing plenty to eat and plenty to drink, which with industry they could easily do. All this might not make them cheerful, but they would certainly be less a prey to melancholy while engaged in some active industry, than if they remained brooding over their fate. These thoughts, as we have said, arose on the morning of the second day succeeding that on which the balloon had been abandoned. Karl gave words to them in an attempt to cheer his brother Caspar, who had relapsed into a state of unusual despondency. Ossaroo equally required cheering, and therefore it devolved on the botanist to attempt enlivening the spirits of his companions. For a time he met with very slight success, but gradually the necessity of action forced itself upon the attention of all, if only to provide the means to keep them from starving, and without further loss of time they resumed the various branches of industry by which they had hitherto been enabled to supply their larder. To Caspar, as before, the chase was entrusted, while Ossaroo attended to the fishing, as he, better than either of the others, understood the management of hooks, lines, and nets. The botanist busied himself in the old way, exploring the valley, in search of such seeds, plants, and roots as might be found wholesome for food, not neglecting others of a medicinal character that might serve in case of sickness. Many such had the young plant hunter encountered during his early researches, and had made note of them against the possibility of their being required. Fortunately, up to that time there had been no real need for any of the party to make trial of the natural pharmacopoeia which the valley afforded, and it was to be hoped they should never have occasion to test the virtues of the specifics which the plant hunter had discovered. Karl nevertheless collected several kinds, and, after submitting them to a process necessary for their preservation, had stored them away within the hut. Of those vegetable products adapted for food, the chief article obtained was the nutritive seed yielded by the edible pine, Pinus gerardiana. The cones of this valuable tree were as large as artichokes, each yielding several seeds of the size and appearance of pistachio nuts. The wild cockscomb, Amaranthus curianthus, also furnished a portion of their supply. Its seeds, when parched and crushed between two stones, produced a kind of meal, of which cakes of bread were manufactured by Ossaroo. These, although very far inferior to the real home bake, or even to the most ordinary production of the bakehouse, were nevertheless sufficiently palatable to those who had no other bread. The lake, besides yielding fish to the nets of Ossaroo, also afforded a supply of vegetables. On searching it, the botanist discovered several edible kinds of plants, among others the curious Trapa bicornis, or horned waternut, known among the natives of the Himalayan countries by the name singara, and much used by them as an article of wholesome food. There was also a splendid water lily, with very broad leaves and large flowers of pink and white colour, the seeds and the stalks of which Karl knew to be edible, as he had read of their being used for this purpose by the poorer people in the country of Cashmere. The lily in question, with Nelumbium speciosum, grows plentifully in the lakes of the far-famed valley so named. On first observing this beautiful plant growing luxuriantly, as it was, in their own little valley lake, Karl took occasion to inform his brother, Ossaroo at the same time listening attentively to his statement, of the various uses made of it by the inhabitants of Cashmere. How the boys sailing about in their boats, when the day chances to be very hot, are in the habit of plucking one of its large shining leaves out of the water and spreading it over their crowns, to protect them from the fervid rays of the sun, and how the petiole of the leaf, being hollow inside, serves them as a tube for drinking out of. Many such interesting particulars in regard to the economy of this fine aquatic plant did the young botanist communicate to his companions, but none more interesting than the fact that both its seeds and stalks are edible, since this promised them additional security against the danger of running short in their supply of vegetable food. End of chapter 53.
Chapter 54 of The Cliff Climbers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Thomas. The Cliff Climbers by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 54. The Bean of Pythagoras. The discovery of the water lily was not a thing of recent occurrence. They had known of its existence before, and more than once had visited the little embayment in the lake which it chiefly grew. In fact, it had attracted their attention a few days after their first arrival in the valley, not by its own conspicuousness, for its broad, round leaves, spread horizontally upon the surface, could scarce be seen from the shore. Only when its beautiful pink-white flowers were in bloom could it be observed at any great distance. That which had first led them to approach the place where it grew and examine the plant was their having noticed a singular phenomenon connected with it, and which for a while had puzzled all three of them to explain. The bed of lilies, at that time in full bloom, was visible from the place where they had originally made their encampment, and every morning just after daybreak, and sometimes also during the day, they were in the habit of seeing some birds disporting themselves near that place in a singular manner, very singular indeed, since birds appeared to walk upon the water. They were tall, long-legged, slender-bodied creatures, and easily distinguished by both Karl and Caspar as belonging to the family of Relidae, or water hens. There could be no doubt that they were walking on the water, sometimes slowly, at other times in a quick run, and, what was even more unaccountable than this, they were seen at times to stand still upon the water. Ay, and what might be considered more surprising still, they performed this aquatic feat upon only one leg. The thing might have been more mysterious had not Karl from the first suspected the reason why the laws of specific gravity appeared to be thus contradicted. He suspected the existence of some plant whose leaves, lying spread on the surface, perhaps offered the footing for the birds, sufficiently firm to support the weight of their bodies. The botanist was only reasoning from remembrance. He had lately read the account published but a few years before of the discovery of the gigantic water lily of tropical America, the Victoria regia, and remembered how its discoverers had spoken of large birds of the crane family making their perch upon its huge leaves, and thus supported, playing about over the surface of the water as if the firm earth had been under their feet. With these facts fresh in his memory, Karl conjectured that the water hens seen by him and his companions were supported on a similar pedestal and playing themselves on a like platform. His conjecture proved correct, for on visiting the place shortly after, the broad orbicular leaves of the Nelumbium speciosum were perceived, almost as large as those of their South American congener. Other interesting points relating to the great lily growing in the Himalayan lake Karl had mentioned from time to time to his companions, for he knew that the Nelumbium speciosum was the celebrated Pythagorean bean mentioned in the writings of the Greeks, more especially by Herodotus and Theophrastes. It is described by these writers as growing plentifully in Egypt, and no doubt was cultivated in that country in their day, though it is not known there at the present time. It is found represented on the Egyptian sculptures, and so accurately has it been described by the Greek writers as to leave no doubt as to the identification of the species. It is one of the plants supposed to be the celebrated lotus of antiquity, and this supposition is probable enough, since not only its succulent stalk but its seeds or beans have been eaten in all times by the people in whose country it grows. It is a food that produces a strengthening effect upon the system, and it is also very refreshing in case of thirst. The Chinese call it Lin Hua, and its seeds, with thin slices of its root mixed with the kernels of apricots and walnuts and placed between the alternate layers of rice, constituted one of the select dishes offered by the great mandarins to the British ambassadors on the visit of the latter to the Celestial Empire. These people store up the roots of the Linghua for future use, preserving them in a pickle of salt and vinegar. The Japanese also make use of the plant as an succulent, and it is, moreover, regarded by them as sacred to their divinities, the images of which are often represented seated upon its large leaves. The flowers of the Nelumbium speciosum, when in full bloom, give out the most fragrant odour, somewhat resembling that of anise, while the seeds, shaped like acorns, have a flavour equal in richness and delicacy to that of the finest almonds. End of chapter 54. Recording by Mark Thomas.
Chapter 55 of The Cliff Climbers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Cliff Climbers by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 55. An Aquatic Harvest. It was not upon that occasion that Karl communicated to his companions all those interesting facts in relation to the great lily. Many of them he had made known long before, especially that the seeds of the plants were eatable, and both Caspar and Ossaroo had often proved to their own satisfaction that they were something more than eatable, in short, a great delicacy. It was from a knowledge of this fact that the thoughts of all three were now turned upon the lilies, those huge, roseate corollas, no longer seen glistening above the surface of the water, proclaimed that the beans were ripe and ready for shelling. The three were about starting from the hut to reap this aquatic harvest, which, judging from the quantity of seed pods that appeared above the surface, promised to be abundant. Each had provided himself with a rush basket, which the shikaree had woven, during the long winter nights, for other purposes. But as they were of just the right size and shape to hold the Pythagorean beans, they were now to be employed in that capacity. Both Karl and Caspar had rolled up their trousers to mid-thigh, so as not to wet them while waiting among the lilies, but Ossaroo, not being provided with any nether garment entitled to the name of trousers, had simply tucked up the skirt of his cotton tunic, making it fast under his girdle. In this guise all three proceeded round the shore of the lake to that side where they would be nearest the bed of lilies. The water hens, seeing them make their approach, rose from their perch upon the leaves, and fluttered off to seek a more secure shelter among the sedge. The aquatic gleaners at once waded in, and commenced picking off the pods, and shelling them into their rush baskets. They had been there before, and knew there was no danger in the depth of the water. They had nearly filled their respective sacks with the Pythagorean beans, and were meditating a return to dry land, when a dark shadow, passing over the tranquil surface of the lake, closely followed by another of similar size and shape, attracted their attention. All three saw the shadows at the same instant of time, and all simultaneously looked up to ascertain what sort of creatures were casting them. In the sky above they beheld a spectacle calculated to inspire them with feelings of a strange interest. Right above the lake, and also over their heads, a brace of large birds was circling in the air. Each was borne up by a pair of huge wings, full 5 yards from tip to tip, while from the body between a neck of enormous length was extended horizontally, prolonged into a tapering pointed beak, in shape like the seed pistil of a pelargonium. Their beaks might well have been compared to the pistil of a pelargonium, or rather the latter should be assimilated to them, since it is from this species of birds the flower has derived its botanical cognomen. The birds were storks, not the ordinary ciconia that makes its home among the Hollanders, or finds a still more welcome hospitality on the roof tree of the Hungarian by the plains of the Puszta, but a stork of far grander dimensions, in short, a stork that is the tallest of his tribe, the adjutant. On looking up, Karl recognized the species. So did Caspar, and at a glance. It required no lengthy scrutiny, no profound knowledge of natural history, to identify the noted adjutant. It only needed to have seen him before, either in propria persona or in a picture. But both brothers had seen specimens of the bird, in full flesh and feather, on the plains of India, in the environs of Calcutta itself. As to the shikaree, was it likely he should be mistaken about the character of those winged giants, those tall scavengers he had seen thousands of times, stalking pompously along the sandy shores of the sacred Ganges? It was not possible for him to have a doubt about the identity of the birds who were now throwing their shadows over that lone lake of the Himalayas. He had no doubt. The very certainty that the birds above him were the gigantic cranes of the Ganges, the sacred birds of Brahma, caused him to utter a sort of frenzied shout, and at the same time dropping his sack of beans into the water. He needed not to look at the color of the birds to note that they were brown-black above and white underneath. The naked vulture neck with its pouch-like appendage of brick-red hue, the silken feathers of bluish-white under the tail, those precious plumes well known and worn by the ladies of many lands under the appellation of marabout feathers, all were recognized at a glance. Even quicker than either of his youthful comrades had the Hindu identified the birds. A single glance sufficed, and simultaneously with that glance had the cry fallen from his lips and the sack of Pythagorean beans from his grasp. The birds were flying slowly, and to all appearance laboriously, as if wearied of wing. They appeared to be in search of some roost on which to repose themselves. That they had entered the valley with this intention was made evident a few moments after, for having made a circuit round the little lake, both at the same instant ceased to ply their long pinions, and drawing their wings suddenly into their bodies, they settled down upon the shore. The spot upon which they had chosen to alight was the prominence, terminating a little peninsula that protruded out almost to the bed of lilies, and from which the three waders had themselves descended into the water. As the latter now stood knee-deep among the aquatic plants, they were distant not more than 20 paces from the point of this peninsula. The storks, after alighting, stood upon the shore in erect attitudes, apparently as unconcerned about the presence of our three adventurers as if the latter were only overgrown stalks of the Pythagorean bean, utterly incapable of doing them an injury. End of chapter 55. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Chapter 56 of The Cliff Climbers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Cliff Climbers by Mayne REID. Chapter 56. The Adjutants. The brace of gigantic birds that had thus alighted by the shore of the little lake were, to say the least, uncouth creatures, for the whole ornithological world might be ransacked without finding a greater oddity than the adjutant. In the first place, it stands 6 feet upon its long, straight shanks, though its actual length, measuring from the tip of its bill to the termination of its claws, is full 7½ The beak of itself is over 1 foot in length, several inches in thickness, with a gibbous enlargement near the middle, and having both mandibles slightly curved downwards. The spread of a full-grown adjutant's wing is 15 feet, or 5 yards, from tip to tip, quite equally in extent, either that of the Chilean condor or the wandering albatross. In color, the adjutant may be described as black above and white underneath, neither that being very pure. The upper plumage is a dirty brownish black, while the belly and underparts present a dull white appearance, partly from an admixture of greyish feathers, but also from the circumstance that the bird is usually bedaubed with dirt, as mud from the marshes where it feeds, and other filth in which it seems to take delight. But for this foulness the legs of the adjutant would be of a dark colour, but in the living bird they are never seen of the natural hue, being always whitened by the dust shaken out of its plumage, and other excrement that attaches itself to the skin. The tail is black above and white underneath, more especially the under coverts, which are of a pure white. These last are the plumes so highly prized under the name of marabout feathers, an erroneous title arising through a mistake made by the naturalist Temminck in comparing the Indian adjutant with another and very different species of the same genus, the marabout stork of Africa. One of the distinctive characteristics of the adjutant, or argala, as it is better known to the Indians, and one, too, of its ugliest features, is a naked neck of a flesh-red colour, the skin shriveled, corrugated, and covered with brownish hairs. These bristles are more thickly set in young birds, but become thinner with age, until they almost totally disappear, leaving both head and neck quite naked. This peculiarity causes a resemblance between the adjutant bird and the vultures. But indeed there are many other points of similarity, and the stork may in all respects be regarded as a vulture, the vulture of the grallatores, or waders. In addition to the naked neck, the adjutant is furnished with an immense dewlap, or pouch, which hangs down upon its breast, often more than a foot in length, and changing from pale flesh color to bright red, along with the skin of the throat. At the back of the neck is found still another singular apparatus, the use of which has not been determined by the naturalist. It is a sort of vesicular appendage, capable of being inflated with air, and supposed to serve as an atmospheric buoy to assist in sustaining the bird in its flight. The inflation has been observed to take place under exposure to a hot sun, and therefore it is natural to infer that the rarefaction of the air has something to do in causing the bird to use this organ. As the adjutant often flies to a great height, it is possible that this balloon-like apparatus is necessary to sustaining it in the rarefied atmosphere found at such an elevation. The annual migration of the bird over the lofty chain of the Himalayas might not be possible, or if possible, more difficult, without this power of decreasing the specific gravity of its body. It is scarce necessary to say that the adjutant, like all birds of the family to which it belongs, is a filthy and voracious feeder, carnivorous in the highest degree, and preferring carrion and garbage to any other sort of food. It will kill and swallow live kind, such as frogs, snakes, small quadrupeds, and birds, the latter not so very small either, since it has been known to bolt a whole fowl at a single swallow. Even a cat or a hare can be accommodated with a passage down its capacious gullet. But it will not attempt to kill either one or the other, since, notwithstanding its gigantic size, it is one of the veriest cowards in creation. A child with a bit of a switch can at any time chase the adjutant away, and an enraged hen will put it to flight whenever it strays into the neighbourhood of her young brood. It does not retreat without first making a show of defiance by placing itself in a threatening attitude, with reddened throat, and a beak wide agap, from which latter proceeds a loud roaring, like that of a bear or tiger. All this, however, is mere braggadocio, for, on the enemy continuing the attack, it immediately cools down, and betakes itself to ignominious flight. Such are a few peculiarities of the gigantic stork, known as the adjutant or argala. It only remains to be added that there are at least 2, perhaps 3, other species of storks of very large dimensions, though not so large as this one, that for a long time have been confounded with it. One of these is the marabou, which inhabits the tropical regions of Africa, and which also produces the plumes so much prized in the world of fashion. The feathers of the African species, however, are far less beautiful and valuable than those of the tail of the adjutant, and it is these last that are really best known as marabou feathers, in consequence of the mistake made by Temminck and propagated by the anatomist Cuvier. Another great stork, differing both from the argala of Asia and the marabou of Africa, inhabits the island of Sumatra. It is known to the natives as the burung cambe, while in the neighbouring island of Java is found either a 4th species of these gigantic birds, or the same that belongs to Sumatra. It is somewhat singular that such creatures should have remained so long unknown to the scientific world. It is not much more than a half a century since travellers began to describe them with any degree of exactness, and even at the present time their history and habits have received but very slight elucidation. This is the more surprising when we consider that on the banks of the Ganges, even in Calcutta itself, the adjutant is one of the most common birds, constantly stalking about the houses and entering the enclosures with as much familiarity as if it was one of the regular domestics of the establishment. Its services as a scavenger procure for it an immunity from persecution, and it is not only tolerated by the people, but encouraged in its advances towards fellowship with them, notwithstanding that at times it becomes rather troublesome in its attentions to the young ducklings, chicklings, and other denizens of the farmyard. Sometimes they are not even contented with such fare as may be found outside, but have been known to enter the bungalow, snatching a smoking joint from the table, and swallow it before either master or servant could rescue the dainty morsel from between their long and tenacious mandibles. When seen in flocks, wading through the water, with wings outstretched, as is their custom, they may be taken for a fleet of small boats. At other times, when stalking about over the sandy shores, and picking up the debris strewed along the banks of the sacred river, they resemble a crowd of native women engaged in the like occupation. Ofttimes they may be seen feeding voraciously upon the filthiest carrion of animals, and not unfrequently upon a human body in a state of putrefaction, the corpse of some deluded victim to the superstition of Juggernaut, which has been thrown into the so-styled sacred river to be washed back on the beach, an object of contention between pariah dogs, vultures, and these gigantic cranes of the Ganges. End of chapter 56. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah.
Chapter 57 of The Cliff Climbers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cliff Climbers by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 57. The Standing Sleepers. The advent of the Adjutants produced a vivid impression on the minds of all three of our adventurers, more vivid, perhaps, upon Ossaroo than either of the others. To him they seemed like old friends who had come to visit him in his prison, and though it never occurred to the shikari that they could be in any way instrumental in obtaining his release, still the impression produced was one of a pleasant nature. He saw before him two creatures whose forms, however uncouth, were associated with the scenes of his earliest childhood, and who could not help a passing fancy that the pair that had thus unexpectedly met their appearance might be the same old cock and hen he had so often seen roosted on the branches of a huge banyan tree that overshadowed the bungalow in which he was born. Of course this could be only fancy on the part of Ossaroo. Out of the thousands of storks that annually make their migration from the plains of Hindostan to the northward of the Himalaya mountains, it would have been a rare coincidence if the two that for years had performed the office of scavengers in the shikari's native village should be identical with those now hovering above his head, for it was while they were yet upon the wing that Ossaroo had indulged in this pleasant speculation. Though scarce serious in his thought, and only entertaining it for an instant, he was nevertheless gratified by the sight of the two storks, for he knew they must have come from his native plains, from the banks of that glorious river, in whose waters he longed once more to wet his feet. The sight of the huge birds suggested to Caspar a different train of thought. As he beheld their immense wings extended in slow but easy flight, it occurred to him that one or other of the great creatures might have the power to perform that task which had proved too much for the bearcoot, and for which the kite had been flied in vain. "Oh!" exclaimed he, as the idea came across his mind, "don't you think, Karl, that either of those great creatures would be strong enough to carry the line aloft? They look as if they could lift even one of ourselves to the top of the cliff." Karl made no reply, though his silence was only caused by Caspar's suggestion, which he was proceeding to ponder upon. The young hunter continued: "If we could only catch one of them alive, Do you suppose they are going to alight? They look as if they would. What do you say, Ossaroo? You know more of these birds than we do." "Yes, youngie Sahib, he speaky the true. They go for come down. You say they make long fly. They both vary on the wing. No able fly further. Sides, ye see, here am the lake, water. They won't drink won't eat too. They sure come down." Ossaroo's prediction was fulfilled almost as soon as it was uttered. The birds, first one and then the other, jerked in their spread wings and dropped down upon the shore of the lake, as already stated, not over 20 paces from the spot where the 3 waders were occupied among the leaves of the lilies. The eyes of all 3 were now directed with a fixed gaze upon the newcomers, in whose behaviour they observed something irresistibly ludicrous. Almost on the instant of their feet touching terra firma, instead of moving about over the ground in search of food, or striding down towards the water to drink, as the spectators were expecting them to do, the 2 long-legged bipeds acted in an entirely different manner. Neither of them seemed to care either for food or drink. If they did, both these appetites must have been secondary with them to the desire for rest, for scarce 10 seconds had elapsed after their alighting when each drew in its long neck, burying it between the shoulders as in a case, leaving visible only the upper half of the head, with its huge side-shaped beak, the mandibles resting against the prominence of the breastbone and pointing diagonally downwards. Simultaneous with this movement, the spectators perceived another, equally indicative of a desire on the part of the birds to betake themselves to repose. This was a drawing up of one of their long fleshless legs, until it was entirely concealed under the loose feathers of the belly, a movement made by both so exactly at the same instant as to lead to the belief that they were actuated by like impulses, by some spiritual union that existed between them. In 10 seconds more both birds appeared to be asleep. At all events their eyes were closed, and not a movement could be detected in their limbs, wings, bodies, or beaks of either. It was certainly a ludicrous sight to see these huge creatures, each supporting itself on a single stalk, so straight and slender that nothing but the nicest balance could have ensured their equilibrium; and this, too, while neither seemed conscious of any danger of toppling over, of which, indeed, there was not the slightest reason to be afraid. The Hindoo had been too long accustomed to this sort of spectacle to see anything in it worthy of being laughed at. Not so Caspar, whose mirth was at once excited to the point of risibility. The unconcerned manner in which the storks had come to a stand, along with the picturesque pose in which they had composed themselves to sleep, was even too much for the stoical Karl, who at once echoed the laughter which his brother had inaugurated. Their united cachinnations rang loudly over the lake, reverberating in repeated peals from the adjacent cliffs. It might be supposed that the fracas thus created would have alarmed the new arrivals, and caused them once more to make an appeal to their wings. Nothing of the sort. The only effect perceptible on either was the opening of their eyes, a slight protrusion of the neck, a shake of the head, an uprising of the long beak, with a quick clattering of its mandibles, which soon becoming closed again, were permitted to drop into their original position of repose. This cool behaviour of the birds only increased the hilarity of the boys, and for several minutes they remained in their places, giving way to loud and uncontrollable laughter. End of chapter 57. Chapter 58 of the Cliff Climbers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cliff Climbers by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 58. Fritz among the Feathers. Their hilarity could not be continued forever. Even that of Caspar came to a termination, though not until his ribs ached with the agreeable exercise. As their bean sacks had been already filled, it was determined that they should first take them to the hut, and then return to the storks with the design of capturing them. Ossaroo was of the opinion that they would have no difficulty in effecting this, declaring the birds to be so tame that he might walk straight up to them and throw a noose over their necks. This, in all probability, he might have done, had he been provided with a piece of cord proper for the making of such a noose. But there was no cord at hand, not even a bit of string, nothing but the rush baskets filled with the lotus beans. To obtain a snare, it would be necessary to make a journey to the hut. In the minds of our adventurers there was no very clear conception of the object of capturing the storks, unless it might have been that the thought, to which Caspar had given speech, was still entertained by himself and his brother. That indeed would have justified them in their attempt to take the birds. Another idea may have suggested itself, more especially to Ossaroo. If nothing else should come of it, there would be some pleasure in holding the birds in captivity, as pets and companions. Ossaroo had been involuntarily contemplating the prospect of a long, lonely life in the solitude of that mountain valley. With such a prospect, even the solemn stork might be regarded as a cheerful companion. Stimulated by these thoughts, and some others of a more indefinite kind, our adventurers came to the determination to ensnare the adjutants. All three commenced wading out of the lake in a direction so as not to disturb the sleepers. Karl and Caspar, now that they had become inspired with a design, lifted their feet out of the water and set them down again as though they are treading upon egg. Ossaroo sneered at their overcaution, telling them that there was not the slightest fear of frightening the storks, and indeed there was truth in what he affirmed. In most countries bordering upon the banks of the Ganges, these birds, protected alike by superstitious fears and edicts of law, have become so used to the proximity of man that they will scarce stir out of their way to avoid him. It was possible that the brace in question might have belonged to some of the wilder flocks inhabiting the swamps of the Sundarbans, and therefore less accustomed to human society. In that case there might be some difficulty in approaching them, and it was for this reason that Ossaroo had consented to adopt the precautions for their capture which Karl had insisted should be taken. The truth is that Karl had conceived a deeper design than either of his companions. It had occurred to him, while engaged with his brother in that laughing duetto, and somewhat to the surprise of Caspar, it had caused a sudden cessation of his mirth, or at least a noisy ebullition of it. The philosopher had become silent and serious, as if the thought had suddenly arisen that hilarity under the circumstances was indecorous and out of place. From that moment Karl had preserved a mysterious silence, even refusing to explain it when interrogated by Caspar. He was only silent on this one theme; otherwise his speech flowed freely enough, in counsel to his companions, charging both to adopt every precaution for ensuring the capture of the storks, and with an eagerness which puzzled them to comprehend. A few minutes' walk brought them back to the hut. It was rather a run than a walk, Karl going in the lead and arriving before either of the others. The bean sacks were flung upon the floor as if they had been empty and of no value, and then the strings and lines that had been spun by Ossaroo were pulled out of their hidden places and submitted to inspection. It did not take long to make a running noose, which was accomplished by the nimble fingers of the shikaree. Easily also was it attached to the end of a long stem of the ringall bamboo, and thus provided, our adventurers once more sallied forth from the hut and made their way towards the sleeping storks. As they drew near, they were gratified at perceiving the birds still in the enjoyment of their meridian slumber. No doubt they had made a long journey, and needed rest. Their wings hung drooping by their sides, proclaiming weariness. Perhaps they were dreaming of a roost on some tall fig tree, or the tower of an antique temple sacred to the worship of Buddha, Vishnu, or Deva, dreaming of the great Ganges and its odorous waves, those savoury morsels of putrefying flesh in which they delighted to dig their huge mattocks of mandibles. Ossaroo, being entrusted with the news, did not pause to think about what they might be dreaming, or whether they were dreaming at all. Enough for him to perceive that they were sleeping, and gliding forward in a bent attitude, silent as a tiger threading his native jungle, the shikaree succeeded in making approach, until he had got almost within snaring distance of the unconscious adjutants. There is many a slip between the cup and the lip. The old saw was illustrated in the case of the shikaree while endeavouring to ensnare the storks, though it was not the snare but the birds that now illustrated the adage. After the attempt had been made, the snare could be still seen in its place, stiffly projecting from the point of the long bamboo rod, while the adjutants were soaring in the air, mounting still higher upward, their slender necks outstretched, their beaks cracking like castanets, and their throats emitting an angry sound like the roaring of a brace of lions. The failure was not to be attributed to Ossaroo, but to the imprudence of one of his companions, an individual of the party, close treading upon his heels. That individual was Fritz. Just as Ossaroo was about casting his loop over the shoulders of a sleeping adjutant, Fritz, who had followed the party from the hut, now for the first time perceiving the birds, rushed forward and seized the tail of one of them between his teeth. Then, as if determined on securing the beautiful marabout feathers, he pulled a large mouthful of them clean out by the roots. This was not exactly the motive that impelled Fritz to make such an unexpected attack. Unexpected, because the well-trained animal would have known better than to fright the game which his masters were in the act of stalking, and such imprudence had never before been displayed by him. It was the particular kind of game that had provoked Fritz to act contrary to his usual habit of caution, for of all the creatures which he had encountered since his arrival in the counted there, was none that had inspired him with a more profound feeling of hostility than these same adjutants. During Fritz's sojourn in the Botanic Gardens of Calcutta, where his masters, it will be remembered, were for some time entertained as guests, Fritz had often come in contact with a brace of these gigantic birds, that were also guests of that justly celebrated establishment. They habitually made their stay within the enclosure, where they were permitted to stalk about unmolested, and pick up such stray scraps as were cast out by the domestics of the curator's mansion. These birds had grown so tame as to take food freely out of the hand of anyone who offered it to them, and with like freedom to take it where it was not offered, but found within reach of their long prehensile beaks. Often had they pilfered provisions to which they were anything but welcome, and, among other acts of their rapacity, there was one of which Fritz had been an interested spectator, and for which he was not likely ever to forgive them. That was their robbing him of a dainty piece of meat, which one of the cooks had presented to Fritz himself, and upon which he had been going to make his dinner. One of the birds had the audacity to seize the meat in its mandibles, jerk it out of the dog's very teeth, and swallow it before the latter had time to offer either interruption or remonstrance. The consequence was, that from that time Fritz had conceived a most rancorous antipathy towards all birds of the genus Ciconia, and the species Argala in particular. And this it was that impelled him, on first perceiving the adjutant, for being by the hut on their arrival he had not seen them before, to rush open-mouthed towards them, and seize the tail of one of them between his teeth. It is not necessary to add that the bird, thus indecorously assailed, took to instant flight, followed by its more fortunate though not less frightened mate, leaving Fritz in a temper to treat marabout feathers as they had never been treated before, even when by the hands of some scorned and jealous vixen they may have been torn from the turban of some hated rival. End of chapter 58.
Chapter 59 of the Cliff Climbers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. The Cliff Climbers by Mayne REID. Chapter 59, Capturing the Storks. Our adventurers witnessed the uprising of the birds with looks that betokened disappointment and displeasure, and Fritz was in danger of getting severely castigated. He merited chastisement, and would have received it on the instant, for Caspar already stood over him with an upraised rod, when an exclamation from Karl caused the young hunter to hold his hand, and save Fritz from the hiding which he was being threatened. It was not for this that Karl had called out. The exclamation that escaped him was of a different import, so peculiarly intoned as to once draw Caspar's attention from the culprit and fix it on his brother. Karl was standing with eyes upraised and gazed fixedly upon the retreating storks, that one whose tail Fritz had taken such an unwarrantable liberty. It was not the ragged marabout feathers hanging half plucked from the posterior of the stork upon which Karl was gazing, but its long legs, that, as the bird rose in its hurried flight, hung slanting downward, extending far beyond the tip of its tail. Not exactly these either was it that it called forth the strange cry, but something attached to them, or one of them at least, which, as it came under the shining rays of the sun, gleamed in the eyes of Karl with a metallic luster. It had a yellowish sheen like gold or burnished brass, but the scintillation of the sun's rays, as they glanced from its surface, hindered the spectators from making out its shape, being able to say exactly what it was. It was only Caspar and Ossaroo who were thus perplexed. Karl knew that glittering meteor, that for a moment had flashed before his eyes like a beam of hope, now slowly but surely departing from him, and plunging him back into the old misery. "Oh, brother!" he exclaimed, as the stork flew upward. "What a misfortune has happened!" "Misfortune? What do you mean, Karl?" You don't know how near we were to a chance of being delivered. Alas, it is going to escape us." "The birds have escaped us, you mean?" inquired Caspar. "What of that? I don't believe they could have carried up the rope anyway. And what good would it be to catch them? They're not edible, and we don't want their feathers, valuable as they may be." No, hurriedly rejoined Karl. "It's not that. "What then, brother?" inquired Caspar, somewhat astonished at the incoherent speeches of the plant hunter. "What are you thinking of?" "Look yonder," said Karl, now for the first time pointing up to the soaring storks. "You see something that shines?" "Ah, on the leg of one of the birds. Yes, I do. I see something like a piece of yellow metal. What can it be?" "I know what it is," rejoined Karl in a regretful tone. "Right well do I know. If we could only caught that bird, there would have been a hope for us. It's no use grieving after it now. It's gone, alas, gone. And you, Fritz, have this day done a thing that will cause us regret, perhaps for the rest of our lives." "I don't comprehend you, brother," said Caspar. "But if it's the escape of the storks that's to be so much regretted, perhaps it will never take place. They don't appear to be in such a hurry to leave us, notwithstanding the inhospitable reception Fritz has given them. See, they're circling about, and as if they intend to come down again. And see also Ossaroo holding out a lure for them. I warrant the old chickaree will succeed in coaxing them back. He knows their habits perfectly." "Oh, merciful Father!" exclaimed Karl, as he looked first at the flying storks and then at Ossaroo. "Be it permitted that he succeeds. You, Caspar, lay hold of Fritz, and give Ossaroo every chance. For your life, don't let the dog get away from you. For your life, for the lives of all of us." Caspar, though still under surprise at the exciting bearing of his brother, did not allow that to hinder him from obeying his command, and rushing upon Fritz, he caught hold of the dog, then placed the hound between his legs. He held him with both hands and knees as tightly as if Fritz had been screwed into a vice. The eyes of all, the dog included, were now turned upon Ossaroo. Caspar contemplated his movements with an undefined interest, while Karl watching them with feelings of the keenest anxiety. The cunning shikaree had not come to the spot unprepared. Having anticipated some difficulty in getting hold of the storks, providentially provided a lure, which in the event of their proving shy, might attract them within reach of his ring-awl. This lure was a large fish, which he had taken out of the larder before leaving the hut, and which he was now holding out as conspicuously as possible to attract their attention. He had gone some distance apart from the others, and especially Fritz, whom he had scolded away from his side, and having stationed himself on a slight eminence near the edge of the lake, he was using all his wiles to coax back the birds that had been so unwittingly compelled to take wing. It was evident to Ossaroo, as well as to the others, that the flight of the storks had been against their will, and that they had reluctantly ascended into the air. They were no doubt weary and wanted rest. Whether this desire would have brought them to earth again, Ossaroo did not stay to determine. As soon as by their actions he became convinced that they saw the fish held out in his hand, he flung the tempting morsel to some distance from him, and stood awaiting the result. It proved a success, and almost there was nothing in the appearance or attitude of Ossaroo to excite the suspicion of the adjuncts. His dark skin and Hindu costume were both well known to them, and though now observed in an odd, out-of-the-way corner of the world, there was no reason for regarding him as an enemy. Fritz was alone the object of their fear, but Fritz was a good way off, and there appeared no longer any reason for dreading him. Reasoning thus, and perhaps with empty stomachs to guide them to a conclusion, the sight of the fish lying unguarded upon the grass put an end to their fears, and, without further hesitation, both dropped down beside it, but at the same instant clutched at the coveted prize, each endeavoring to be the first in securing it. As one of the birds got hold of the fish by the head and the other by its tail, a struggle now arose as to which should be the first to swallow its body. Each soon passed a portion of it down its capacious throat, until its mandibles met in the middle and cracked against each other. As neither would yield to the other, so neither would consent to disgorge and let go, and for some seconds this curious contention was kept up. How long it might have continued was not left to the determination of the parties themselves, but to Ossaroo, who, while they were thus occupied, rushed upon the spot, and, flinging wide his arms, enfolded both the birds in an embrace from which they vainly struggled to get free. With the assistance of Karl and Caspar, who had in the meantime tied Fritz to a tree, the huge creatures were soon overpowered and pinioned beyond the possibility of escape. End of chapter 59. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. Chapter 60 of The Cliff Climbers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. The Cliff Climbers by Mayne REID. Chapter 60. A Labeled Leg. It is, cried Karl, stooping suddenly down and grasping the shank of one of the birds. What? Inquired Caspar. Look, brother, see what is there, around the stork's leg. Do you not remember having seen that bit of jewelry before? A brass ring? Oh, yes, replied Caspar. Now I do remember in the Botanic Gardens there was an adjutant with a ring round its ankle. A very brass ring, too, just like this one. Oh, how very odd. Like? Echoed Karl. Not only like, but the very same. Stoop down and examine it more closely. See those letters? R.B.G. Calcutta, slowly pronounced Caspar, as he read the inscription graven upon the ring. RBG. What do these initials stand for, I wonder? Oh, it's not difficult to tell that, knowingly answered Karl. Royal Botanical Garden. What else could it be? Nothing else for certain. These two birds must be the same we used to see there, and with which we so often amused ourselves. The same, asserted Karl, no doubt of it. And Fritz must have recognized them, too, when he made that unprovoked attack upon them. You remember how he used to quarrel with them? I do. He must not be permitted to assail them any more. I have a use for them. A use? Ah, a most important one. So important that these birds, ugly and unamiable as they are, must be cared for, as if they were prettiest and most prized pets. We must provide them with food and water. We must tend to them by day and watch over them by night, as though they were some sacred fire which it was our duty to keep constantly burning. All that, indeed, said Caspar. Verily, brother, the possession of these storks is not only important, it's essential to our safety. If they should die in our hands, or escape out of them, even if one of them should die or get away, we are lost. Our last hope lies in them. I'm sure it is our last. But what hope have you found in them? Interrogated Caspar, puzzled to make out the meaning of his brother's words, and not without wonder at their apparent wildness. Hope, every hope, aye, something more than hope, for in the singular incident I cannot fail to recognize the finger of a merciful God. Surely he hath at length taken compassion upon us. Surely it is he who has sent these birds. They are messengers from heaven. Caspar remained silent, gazing earnestly in the eyes of his brother, that were now sparkling with mingled gratitude and joy. But although Caspar could perceive this expression, he was utterly unable to interpret it. Ossaroo was alike puzzled by the strange looks and speeches of the Sahib Karl, but the Hindoo gave less heed to them, his attention being almost wholly taken up by the adjutants, which he found in turns taking to them and embracing them, as if they had been his brothers. As soon as the cord had been looped around their ankles, and there was no longer any danger of their getting away, Ossaroo cut up the fish into slices convenient for their gullets, and proceeded to feed them with as much fondness as he could have shown to a brace of human beings who had arrived from a long journey in a state of starvation. The storks exhibited no signs of shyness, not the slightest. It was not in their nature to do so. They gobbled up the morsels flung before them with as much avidity and unconcern as if they were being fed by the side of the great tank in the garden at Calcutta. The sight of Fritz alone had a disturbing influence upon them, but by the command of Karl, the dog was kept out of view until they had finished the meal with which Ossaroo had provided them. Caspar, still in a cloud, once more interrogated the plant hunter as to his purpose. "Oh, brother," answered Karl, "you are not wont to be so dull of comprehension. Can you not guess why I am so joyed by the presence of these birds?" "Indeed, I cannot, unless what? You expect them to carry a rope up the cliff?" "Nothing of the sort. Yes, perhaps it is something of the sort, but since you have made such a poor guess, I shall keep you in suspense a little longer." "Oh, brother." "Nay, I shall not tell you. It's news worthy guessing at, and you and Ossaroo must make it out between you." The two hunters, thus challenged, were about entering upon a series of conjectures when they were interrupted by Karl. "Come," said he, "there's no time now. You can exercise your ingenuity after we have got home to the hut. We must make sure of the storks before anything else be attended to. This cord is too slight. They may file it in two with their strong bills, and get free. The very strongest rope we have got will not be more than sufficient. Come, Ossaroo, you take one. Lift it up in your arms. I shall carry the other myself. While you, Caspar, see to Fritz. Lead the dog in a leash. From this time forward he must be kept tied up, lest any misfortune should happen to spoil the best plan that is yet offered for our deliverance." So saying, Karl flung his arms around one of the adjutants. Ossaroo, at the same instant, embraced the other. Despite the roaring that proceeded from their throats, and the clattering made by their mandibles, the huge birds were borne home to the hut. On arriving there, They were carried inside and fastened with strong ropes, carefully attached to their legs and tied to the heavy beams forming the rafters of the roof. The door was to be kept shut upon them at all times when the eyes of the captors were not watching them. For Karl, knowing the importance of having such guests, was determined to make sure of his game. End of chapter 60. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. Chapter 61 of the Cliff Climbers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. The Cliff Climbers by Mayne REID. Chapter 61. Mail Carriers on Wings. It was only after they had gone back for their basket of beans, and once more returned to the hut, that Caspar and Ossaroo found time to indulge in their conjectures. They both of them set to work in earnest, seated upon the great stones outside the door, where often before they had conjured up schemes for their deliverance. Neither communicated his thoughts to the other. Each silently followed the thread of his own reflections, as if there was a rivalry between them as to who should be the first to proclaim the design already conceived by Karl. Karl was standing close by, apparently as reflective as either of his companions, but his thoughts were only occupied in bringing to perfection the plan which to them was still undiscovered. The storks had been brought out of the hut and tied to a heavy log that lay near. This had been done partly to accustom them to the sight of the place, and partly that they might be once more fed, the single fish that they had swallowed between them not being deemed sufficient to satisfy their hunger. Caspar's eyes wandered to that one that had the ring upon its leg, and then to the ring itself. R.B.G. Calcutta. The inscription at length proved suggestive to Karl, as the ring itself, on first seeing it, had to his brother. On that bit of brass there was information. It had been conveyed all the way from Calcutta by the bird that bore the shining circlet upon its shank. By the same means, why not information being carried back? I have it, shouted Caspar, without waiting to pursue the thread of conjecture that had occurred to him. Yes, dear Karl, I know your scheme, I know it, and by Jupiter, it's a capital one. So you've guessed it at last, rejoined Karl, rather sarcastically. Well, it's high time, I think. The sight of that brass ring with its engraved letters should have led you to it long ago. But come, let us hear what you have got to say, and judge whether you have guessed correctly. Oh, certainly, assented Caspar, taking up the tone of the jocular in which his brother had been addressing him. You intend making a change in the character, or rather the calling, of these lately arrived guests of ours. Caspar pointed to the storks. That is your intention, is it not? Well, they are now soldiers, officers, as their title and port, adjutants. Well, said Karl. They will have no reason to thank you for your kind intentions. The appointment you are about to bestow on them can scarce be called a promotion. I don't know how it may be with Bird, but I do know that there are not many men ambitious of exchanging from the military to the civil service. What appointment, Caspar? If I'm not mistaken, you mean to make mail carriers of them. Postmen, if you prefer the phrase. Ha ha! Laughed Karl in a tone expressive of gratification at the clever manner in which Caspar had declared himself. Right, brother. You guessed my scheme to the very letter. That is exactly what I intend doing. By the wheels of Juggernaut Coachee, cried the shikaree, who had been listening and understood the figurative dialogue. Dat be a goody plan. These storks go back Calcutta. Surely they go back. They carry letter to the Ferengi Sahibs. Sahibs, do they know we're here in prison? Then they deliver us the day after they get the letter. Ha 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 ha! Then delivering himself of a series of shrill ejaculations, the Hindoo sprang up from the stone upon which he had been sitting, and danced around the hut as if he had suddenly taken leave of his senses. However imperfectly spoken, the words of Ossaroo had disclosed the whole plan, as conceived by the plant hunter himself. It had vaguely defined itself in Karl's mind on the first seeing the storks above him in the air, but when the luster of metal flashed before his eyes, and he perceived that yellow band encircling the shank of the bird, the scheme became more definite and plausible. When at length the storks were taken captive, and Karl deciphered the inscription by which they were identified as old acquaintances of the R.B.G., he no longer doubted that Providence was in the air, and that these winged messengers had been sent, as it were, from heaven itself, to deliver him and his companions from that prison in which they had so long been pining. End of chapter 61. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. Chapter 62 of the Cliff Climbers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. The Cliff Climbers by Mayne REID. Chapter 62. Conclusion. The deliverance came at length, though it was not immediate. Several months more of that lonely and monotonous life were our adventurers called upon to endure. They had to wait for the return of the rainy season, when the rivers that traverse the great plains of the Hindostan became brimful of flood, bearing upon their turbid bosoms that luxuriance not of life but of death, which attracts the cranes and the storks once more to seek subsistence upon their banks. Then the great adjutant returns from his summer tour to the north, winging his way southward over the lofty summits of the Imbu. Then, too, did Karl and his comrades believe that their adjutants would be guided by a like instinct, and go back to the R.B.G., the Royal Botanic Garden of Calcutta. Karl felt confident of their doing so, as certain almost as if he stood on the banks of the sacred stream in the R.B.G. itself, and saw them descending from their aerial flight and aligning with the enclosure. This confidence arose from the remembrance of his having heard, while sojourning with the curator, that such had been their habit for many years, and that the time both of their departure and arrival was so periodically regular that there was not an employee of the place who could not tell it to the day. Fortunately, Karl remembered the time, though not the exact day. He knew the week, however, in which his guests might be expected to take their departure, and this was enough for his purpose. During their stay in the valley, the birds had been cared for, as if they had been sacred to some deity, adored by those who held them in charge. Fish and flesh had they plenty, with Ossaroo as their provider, food and drink whenever they stood in need of either, freedom from annoyance, and protection from enemies of every kind, even from Fritz, who had long since ceased to be their enemy. Nothing had been wanting to their comfort. Everything had been granted, everything but liberty. This, too, was at length restored to them. On a fair morning, such a bird might have chosen for its highest flight, both were set free to go wherever they listed. The only obstruction to their flight was a pair of small skin sacks, one attached to the neck of each, and prudently placed beyond the reach of its mandibles. Both were furnished with this curiously contrived bag for Karl, as the spare leaves of his memorandum book enabled him to do. He had determined that each should be entrusted with a letter, and lest one should go astray, he had sent his dispatch in duplicate. For a time the birds seemed reluctant to leave those kind of companions, who had so long fed and cherished them. But the instinct that urged them to seek the sunny plains of the south at length prevailed, and giving scream of adieu, reciprocated by the encouraging shouts of those they were leaving behind, and a prolonged baying from the throat of the boar-hound Fritz, they soared aloft into the air, and in slow, solemn flight ascended the cliff, soon to disappear behind the crest of the encircling ridge. 10 days after, on that same cliff stood a score of men, a glad sight to Karl, Caspar, and Ossaroo. Even Fritz barked with joy as he beheld them. Against the blue background of the sky, it could be perceived that these men carried coils of rope, pieces of wood, and other implements that might be required for scaling a cliff. Our adventurers now knew that one or other or both copies of their duplicate dispatch must have reached the destination for which it had been designed, and the same destination was soon after reached by themselves, by the help of their rescuers. The long rope ladders which they let down, all three succeeded in climbing the cliff, Fritz making the ascent upon the shoulders of the shikaree. All three, amidst a company of delighted deliverers, with Fritz following at their heels, once more descended the southern slope of the Himalayas, once more stood upon the banks of the sacred Ganges, once more entered with the hospitable gates of the RBG, there to renew their acquaintance, not only with the hospitable friends, but with those winged messengers, by whose instrumentality they had been delivered from their living tomb, and once more restored to society and the world. End of chapter 62. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan. End of the Cliff Climbers by Mayne REID.